刚才的这个思想先驱报这个环节中，我们为大家介绍了 Gavaco 的创始人盖夫对于中国经济的一系列评论。接下来他又谈到了国际局势以及中国在整个国际产业结构上力量的变化盖夫就讲到几个月前他刚去了一趟日本，去东京的市中心吃了一顿非常丰盛精致的午餐，结果一结账的时候发现只有$15，把他吓了一跳。那我们知道在纽约曼哈顿你随随便便在街头找一个相对来讲卫生条件好一点的小店，你买个三明治加上税加上小费可能就20块钱了。怎么现在日本变得这样便宜呀？他说如果你是在90年代在2000年初去过日本，可能你会觉得非常的震惊，因为大家对于东京对于日本一直以来的印象是非常贵的，
对，昂贵，
非常的昂贵。但是现在日本那个物价便宜的就像发展中国家一样。
对呀，
日元如此的。
上次我们不是进了一帮日本朋友吗？我就在讲，日本我就不想去因为为什么太贵了？其实我很喜欢日本，他们说你没问题，你的收入多少？我就告诉了我的退休之后的收入多少？他说你这种收入在东京活得很好。但是所以天天看新闻呢，有时候你真的不知道这个世界变化的这么大，日本这么便宜。
你看这我们就说到，
我原来老是想去越南，现在看样子去日本没问题。
说你和盖夫的差别何明先生一听日本便宜，马上就想到去日本退休。人家盖夫马上就想到，既然现在日元这么疲软，理论上来讲，日本的这一些制成品和高科技产品出口应该相当有竞争力因为本国的货币价值低那为什么在过去几年日本如此的日元疲软，日本这么便宜的情况下，日本汽车出口和电子产品的出口却被中国领先了呢？这咱们就看出境界的差别了。他首先想到的是宏观经济问题，何明先生首先想到的是退休问题。其实还不仅仅是跟日元竞争，中国按理说应该是一个上坡爬坡的路。刚才我们讲到，中国自己本身有房地产的萧条，有美国对于中国的限制问题。就在这么多的限制之下，在过去的这5年之内，还有3年疫情封锁的情况下，中国到底是怎么一跃就成为世界上最大的汽车出口国了？它不仅仅是要完成自己的一个产业技术升级，也要面临国际上很多重的这样的不利环境。那我们再说到欧洲曾经有这样的一个新能源转换的目标，到2030年，每一辆在欧洲售出的汽车都是电动汽车。但是盖夫就说，现在欧洲人终于是意识到了一个让他们觉得有一点可怕的现实：如果真是在2030年在欧洲卖出的每一辆车都是电动车，那么可能意味着欧洲每一辆卖出的车都是中国车。因此这个问题也让现在的欧洲人觉得十分的没有办法，到底应该怎么办？其实不仅仅是电动车，还有铁路发电厂涡轮等等等等，中国的这个制成品向整个全世界的出口，现在呢已经成为了既是中国制造力量的象征，也成为了中国很多国家贸易摩擦的一个重要的一个环节。还不仅仅是制成品，这个盖夫就讲到说，作为一个法国人我之前看到中国向沙特卖了一座核电站，这个消息让我觉得作为法国人的骄傲是受到了很严重的打击。
对呀，因为中国的第一代核电站就是法国人在这个大亚湾核电站建的。
对呀，他就说我觉得我们向全世界出口核电站，应该是我们法国人现在还做的为数不多能够做好的事情结果居然中国人卖给了沙特核电站。你仔细一看，中国的价格比我们法国建同样的核电站价格要便宜1/3到1半，还不仅仅是核电站，什么铁路汽车中国已经远远不是过去那个建塑料玩具的中国了，现在是真刀真枪的铁路，已经不是乐高积木了。他就说我和美国人谈话的时候经常说中国人偷了我们的知识产权和技术，但是他就讲到了一点，你特斯拉的电池现在是用中国的，是世界最好的电池，那中国是从哪里偷来的？你说要是第2名从第1名那里偷来的技术可以，那第1名应该向谁去偷呢？这个中国的这个核电站，他们是从零开始建的项目，你核材料是从哪里偷来的？如果是从我们法国这里偷来的核材料，这不是一个重大的一个核机密的一个泄露案件吗？到底是从哪里偷来的？因此他就非常说，我就非常反感一提到中国的进步就说是偷来的、抢来的这一种说法。但是中国到底是怎样力量崛起的呢？那么盖夫在这一篇这个播客采访中谈到了很多方面，时间关系我们不详细介绍，但是其中有一点我特别希望向我们的观众朋友们进行说明，就是中国这一种强大的理工学生文化。 他就讲到啊，说我一个小侄女现在正在伦敦的这个帝国理工学院读生物医学工程的博士学位，说非常的聪明啊，她呢小女孩也非常的有理想，将来希望就自己能够成为攻克癌症的这个人。结果啊，他的这个小侄女回来就说啊，说我们现在帝工理工学院这个医学院里啊，有一半都是中国人啊，另外呢一半不是中国人。另外不是中国人那一半呢，基本都是印度人。那就有一个问题，欧美人到底去哪里了啊？我们说医学还是一个相当时髦前沿的这样的一个学科，怎么现在美国人和欧洲人都不学了呢？那么盖夫就讲到说啊，不管是欧洲还是美国，可能美国更严重一些，都严重的低估了 STEM 我们叫做理工科学科的价值。不仅仅是在大学阶段，在小的时候都是这样。可能现在大家唯一关注的还是计算机，那还是因为计算机现在是大热点啊，挣钱挣得多。你看看现在还有哪些美国孩子在学有机化学？
美国的孩子就是学两样，就是家里条件非常好的就无所谓啊，学这个文学、艺术啊、建筑啊，就是提高自己的修养的这个学问、文科。另外一批绝大多数的中产阶级或者是一般的民众学的就是服务业，什么律师啦、会计师啦、这个医生。你要去学这个工程技术啊、工程管理还可以。啊，系统管理还可以，啊，你要是学真正的基础科学，非常非常之低。
的确啊，美国人呢喜欢做管理者，
对，
喜欢做老板，喜欢呢就是像律师啊，像金融服务都是这种给人建议啊，给人做这样。但是真正去做材料科学，去做这个，
其实他当一个医生也是小老板，因为他下面有一帮护士啊，蛮有老板的感觉。
材料科学、有机化学、生物学这一些非常苦的啊，需要你真正去做很多我们叫做需要高智商的人去做蓝领工作的人，往往美国孩子和欧洲孩子不吃这一种苦。但是他又讲到了一个问题，说你不要看到现在有人说啊，说美国现在虽然是STEM 学生不多了，但是呢，美国的这个经济仍然是非常强大呀，美国有强大的金融体系呀。咱们到底应该怎么比中国和美国现在的经济体量啊？从名义 GDP 来看，整个美国的经济体量比中国大概大1/3左右。但是真正有趣的是什么呢？就是你分开产业来看，那我们知道 GDP 有第一产业、第二产业、第三产业。第一产业农业和采矿业啊，第一产业是农业，第二产业是这个制造业和采矿业，第三产业呢就是我们一般说的服务业，包括金融啊、教育啊、医疗啊等等等等。那如果按照细分来看的话，中国的这个经济规模啊，这个中国的第二产业的规模比美国要大60%，甚至是到1倍还多，因为中国本身物价还比较便宜，所以看你怎么算啊。但是呢，中国的服务业就是第三产业是美国的多少呢？20%，美国是中国的5倍还多。的确，从这个数字来看，美国经济体量比中国大，那还是大相当之多的。美国的服务业是中国的5倍呀，那这中国到底是怎么赶得上啊？但是有一个问题，就是美国的这一些服务业中，包括我们说的医疗，包括大学教育，这个价格是中国的比例，往往不是同日而语的比例啊。那我们说医疗保健业整个行业占到多少？占到整个美国 GDP 的16%到18%左右。
不过其中17%都是浪费，
可能都是浪费。那我们在美国，我们有这样的感觉，美国的天价医疗。那中国的很多医疗是我们叫做是不花钱的，那这一部分是不计入 GDP 的。
对。
再比如说这个美国的教育是算到第三产业里面的啊。美国一个大学，可能是每年的学费，如果你是付全额学费，比如说5万美元到6万美元。中国一个大学生去念大学，一年的学费是多少？2000人民币。那这个中间你说，
美国的公立大学可能也有3万的吧
，3万多块钱这样，因为还要加上其他的一些
基本上4、5万块钱。
那我们就说，这个中国的教育质量真的是美国教育质量的2000块人民币和5万美元的差距。
对，我还真要请教你这个问题啊，就是今天我正好有朋友跟我讲到说，清华大学有个教授啊，因为现在社交媒体很多啊，尤其是这个知识分子的妖孽互证啊，让我很害怕，所以呢，我就不太愿意听这些东西。你愿意听一听《思想先驱报》李杰博士给我们介绍西方的专业的分析，但是呢，这个节目啊，还是让我产生了一个疑问。这个学者主要是讲这个中国清华大学的理工科的教育比美国落后30年
那看是什么专业，如果是基础科学，比如说数学这一种，我是相信的。但是如果说是工程，如果是力学啊，如果是其他的一些，那我觉得并不一定是这样啊。其实有很多方面。那如果我们是从这个专利数量来看的话，可能中国占了优势，但是专利的质量那比美国是落后的。基础研究学科上差别非常大，但是应用科学，特别是工程科学上，现在真的不一定差别这么大。这个话题啊，咱们以后再讲。今天时间紧张，先着重介绍盖夫先生的观点。因此啊，我们就看到中国的这个教育呀、医疗啊等等这一些保险费用，由于它是政府担保的相当一大部分，它是不计入 GDP 的，而这一部分在美国又是非常昂贵的。因此，你说美国的这个服务业真的是生产力、生产总值达到了中国的5倍之多吗？这个数字也要画上问号。因此啊，中国和美国经济体量的差距，可能往往不是表面上看数字这么简单的。那么刚才我们就涉及了一个问题：中国制造业领先，但为什么中国的服务业还落后？一方面是我们刚才提到的有一个价值的问题，私人还是公立环节是否计入 GDP 这样的一个技术性的问题。但是的确，中国的服务业和金融行业的这个发展水平啊，还是有相当大的落差。那么到底应该怎么解释呢？现在我们可能说啊，中国政府要发展制造业啊，不能够藏富于民，必须要藏富于国，全部集中在国企和大企业中。这呢，当然是一种我们叫做政治化的理解角度。但是在盖夫看来，有一个更简单的解释。就是这个经济学上有这样的一个叫做中型分布的一个观点，就是什么呢？就是说人的这个收入啊，在整个社会中大概是这样一个我们叫做中型曲线啊。往往大多数人的收入是集中在中间这一部分的，收入非常低和收入非常高都是比较少的。那比如说在中国，如果说人均的收入是1万美元，那可能基本上60%的中国人的收入都是在2000美元到这个2万美元之间啊。收入低于5000美元的，收入高于1500美元的，都是占比较小的一部分。但是有一个重要的问题，消费特别是服务消费往往是有门槛的。比如说你可能这个收入达到了2000美元一年，你才能买得起智能手机；收入只有1000美元的时候，那你可能买电视啊；收入达到了1万美元买车啊，那可能是收入达到了1万5，你可能在教育上花更多的钱啊；收入达到了2万3万，你可能在金融服务上花更多的钱；收入到10万以上了，你可能买共同基金啊，开设经济账户啊，等等等等。所以对于中国来说啊，整个中国的平均收入仍然是在一个我们叫做比较低的一部分，它的这个消费门槛还没有跨到。过去是中国人家里没有电器，现在中国人家里人人有电器了。这一条曲线是一个加速曲线，它一向右移动，大家的这个收入能力和消费能力就提高一截。比如说在2000年的时候，中国每年大概是卖出200万辆汽车；2007年的时候，中国每年汽车销量是多少？将近2000万辆，也就是在短短的几年之间，汽车销量就增长了10倍。那么就是什么呢？你这个曲线向右移动20%，不是说你的需求增加20%，可能是翻倍的增长。
对，
因为呢，你中国还经历这样的一个我们叫做消费跨级这样的一个问题。但是美国是什么呢？就是说美国已经经过了这样一个这个我们叫做集中消费跨级的阶段。美国现在可能需要跨过的门槛是人人开设股票账户、人人开设基金账户这样的一个门槛。因此从这个角度来看，中国现在在服务上产生的价值比较少，本质上还是由中国的发展阶段所决定的。中国现在刚刚到了买高端消费品和制成品这样的一个门槛上，你让中国人人都有股票投资，人人都有金融消费，人人都在享受高端的服务和私立教育人人都在去私人的诊所享受非常高昂的私人保健服务。那么现在中国还没有到这个阶段，因此从这样的一个角度，你光说中国的消费和这个制成比例和美国相比有很大的不平衡，似乎是用苹果和橘子相比较，因为两个国家集中在非常大的这样的一个不同的发展阶段上。那么盖夫又谈到了另外一个我们最近经常谈到的问题，就是失业问题。那我们现在谈到中国每年几千万年轻人毕业，这几千万年轻人毕业怎么会产生20%的失业率呢？盖夫就讲到了一个不同的观点，说这一些孩子想要的工作是什么呢？是有空调的办公室里面，每天拿着电话，拿着笔记本电脑，他们已经不想着是大锤浇筑混凝土、打路面这一种工作了。20年前，中国面临的挑战是什么？2000万农民工离开农场进城市。当时的农民工进城找工作就是建铁路线呐，帮助城市建设呀，等等等等。你要把一个农民工改造成一个砌砖工，其实并不难，做的都是体力活。但是每年这几千万大学生毕业找到工作，哪有那么多的服务业的工作给他们做呀？中国这一代年轻人，他们整个的这个大学生 这个数量的变化太过于快了，但是整个中国从制造业向服务业的转型可没有那么快。所有的孩子一下子他们接受的是白领的教育，但是中国这个社会没有那么快转型成一个白领和消费金融服务业的这样的一个过程。所以啊，本质上来讲，现在中国的这样的一个失业问题，不是经济的衰退，而是中国经济的转型赶不上中国人接受技术教育和接受职业转型这种观念的变化速度。但是这是不是对于中国是很严重的挑战呢？当然是挑战，大家没有满意，
因为这是现实问题啊。
对，大家没有满意的工作。但是啊，从这个经济的角度来看啊，这个事儿啊也不至于成为危机。为什么这么说呢？现在这几年毕业的学生啊，往往是4个祖父母啊，2个父母，没有表兄弟姐妹。那么基本上啊，就是我们就说独生子女这一代啊，是可以选择留在家里的啊。那么现在不想出去工作了，那也不要到外面去租房子，像美国的年轻人这样，回家住就可以了嘛，回家休息几个月就可以了嘛，对吧？所以对于整个中国的这个社会稳定，可能并不构成威胁。但是啊，他又讲到了另外一面，大家也不要小看中国经济不好这几年这一批年轻人。之前呢，我们为大家介绍过一本书啊，就是迈克尔·刘易斯写的一本书，叫做《Outliers》，叫做奇迹或者叫做不同寻常者。他就讲到啊，美国这一批最著名的技术公司的创始人，比如说微软啊、苹果啊、甲骨文的创始人，哎，你看他们的生日基本都是前后12个月或者是18个月内出生的。那为什么会出现这种情况呢？就是在他们上大学的最后的一年，所有这些人都从大学辍学了。当时正好是1974年到1975年，美国正在经历一场经济衰退。本来呀，如果你赶上经济的好时候，你可能去摩根士坦利啊，你去高盛啊，到那里啊，你努力工作就完了啊。干了几年之后，在这个汉普顿买了房子，买了跑车，你没有任何理由去走任何创业的弯路。那你如果有按部就班的好工作，你干嘛还要冒险呢？当时正好是因为美国经济形势不好，任何地方都没有工作，所以才产生了这样一批辍学者，他们走了一条弯路、冒险路，但是反而是成就了美国历史上最伟大的公司。因此啊，盖夫也提出了一个观点，就是我们之前在节目中也提出的，经济不好不一定意味着公司不好，反而是一些最优秀的公司可能是在经济逆境中产生的。这呢是他提出另外一个有趣的观点。今天节目最后啊，我们还会谈到有关于美元的债务危机的问题。那么我先请何明先生来简单点评一下，对于盖夫先生对于中国现在现况经济的这一种谈法，你觉得是不是有道理？
不仅是有道理的问题，一下子让我感觉到可以用这样一种思考的方式来去进行这个比较啊。即使这些情况，很多朋友都在中国，他们知道今天的这些数字，或者甚至知道实际的这个感受，但是还是存在于这样一种悲观，这样一种失望。我不能说他们这种情绪是错误的啊，我只是说，如果你听一听别人这种分析的方式，也许会鼓励你的这个人生。我们有时候啊，有句话呀，就批评这个江青呐，他们乱搞文化大革命。但是我们就说，有时候他样板戏啊，有一句话呀，还是蛮经典的。其中有一句话是“勤人的孩子早当家”，什么意思？当一个家庭或者一个社会产生一个贫困和危机的时候，一批人就在想办法来改变命运。改变命运的中间，有时候只是一个生活的改变，有一些人就把时代给改变了。
好，谢谢何明先生的点评啊。穷人的孩子早当家，那不知道现在这一些迷茫的年轻人中，有的人是不是就选择了一条冒险路，反而是做出了可能他选择到大公司随便做一份工作所创造不出来的这样的一种新的发明和创造啊。那么在这个采访的最后一段的时候呢，盖夫先生谈到了他对于现在国际局势的看法啊。美国呢一直是一个逆差国，我们平时谈到中国的债务，那美国的债务情况是怎样的呢？那我们说，美国现在是占到整个全球人口的4%，但是美国占到了全球预算赤字的多少呢？占到了40%。美国的占到了整个全球经常账户赤字的多少呢？是占到了60%。因此，就是美国必须需要不断的吸引外资。历史上啊，美国也是这样，但是呢，从来之前都没有任何问题。但是在这一轮经济周期中啊，大家开始对于美国的这个债务问题啊是越来越敏感，因为数字越来越大， 市场呢也感觉到越来越不舒服。在这样的一个背景下呀，更多的国家开始选择叫做多元化。之前呢，我们看到沙特阿拉伯的央行和这个中国人民银行、中国的央行是签订了这个货币互换协议。为什么要这么做呢？他们的很多货币都是和美元挂钩的呀，为什么不直接与美元进行交易呢？反而是与中国签订的到期协议。那么盖夫先生就分析这可能是一个重要的一个信号，就是大宗商品可能成为去美元化的第一个阵地。现在沙特已经发出了一个比较实质的信号，就是可能会放弃美元，与中国签署长期的石油交易协议，直接通过双边货币结算的形式来进行大宗商品的贸易。在盖夫先生来看，这才是近年来货币历史上最大的重大发展之一但是我们好像很少听到有关于这样事件的分析。在媒体中我们也很少看到中国到底是怎样让伊朗和沙特握手达成和平协议的。在盖夫先生来看，这是这一世纪地缘政治一个最伟大的转折，意义可能就如经济上的戴维营协议。这样的一次中东的和平协议，不是美国在背后斡旋磋商而成的，而是中国磋商而成的。实际上呢，在盖夫先生来看，中国并不是用地缘政治和外交手腕来达成的，完全是通过经济手段达成的这样的一个平衡。中国可以跟沙特和伊朗说我是你们最大的贸易伙伴你们现在卖给我的东西比你卖给世界上其他地方的东西都多。那么现在呢，我要和你们做更多的生意，我要和你们做更多的国家投资。通过这样的一种经济关系，以自己作为一个中间枢纽，反而是把沙特和伊朗的关系进行平衡了。中国自己的利益也交缠在其中，因此中国自己也有动力遏制住伊朗的在区域中的敌对行为，也遏制住沙特对于伊朗的进击性行为，因为中国自己的能源命脉也在这里。那么中国现在有很多的贸易盈余，但是我们注意到一点，中国没有把这些贸易盈余换成美元或者是美债，反而是在用这些盈余建立石油储备或者是能源储备。刚才我们说了，中国每月的贸易顺差大概是800多亿，但是现在中国没有再更多的购买美国国债，反而是到手的美国国债到期就不再积累美国国债了，这是非常重要的一部分。对于中国而说中国现在每天进口大概100万桶石油，或者叫50万到150万桶，大概是这样一个区间。那你进口这么多石油，因为我们知道能源的价值也是非常脆弱的那么你怎么处理这些额外的石油储备呢？盖夫先生就提出了一个观点，他们可能是能源换能源以此在非洲买铜矿，在阿根廷买农地种粮食等等等等。不管你有什么样的资产来出售，我可能都买。那么从20年的角度来看的确，你去扎哈尔，你去赞比亚，你去莫桑比克买铜矿、买金属矿，可能比你拥有美国国债更明智。这可能是中国现在所谓的一盘大棋就是通过大宗商品和能源交易来部分的取代美元、美债的相关的问题。美国政府到底是不是真的会遇到资金的问题呢？有关于这一点经济学家也有很多不同的考虑。但是基本可以肯定的是，一旦美国政府是真的受到了债务问题的刺激，美联储就会介入，让美元贬值第一次呢，美元贬值下跌，马上呢，美元经济就会得到这样的一种提振。特别是很多跟工业相关的州密歇根州宾夕法尼亚铁锈带印第安纳州等等等等。那么这一些州都会感觉很好，因为你的出口制成品便宜了，美国的商品在世界上更有竞争力了，等等等等。但是美联储一旦介入，最终不可避免的一个结果就是什么呢？通货膨胀加剧，美元贬值，债务印刷更高的通货膨胀。因此未来美联储几乎是避不开的，会把美国债务货币化这样的一个情况，会创造短暂的繁荣。但是呢，长远而看，很难看到这样的一个方式对于美国美债的坚挺力和全球的影响力是一个好事。那么有关于投资的建议盖夫先生在这一次采访的末尾也提出了一个非常有趣的想法。他又讲到在拉美有一句谚语，就是故事总是一样的，你不会犯你父亲犯下的错误，你可能还会犯你祖父犯下的错误。什么意思？拉美不久前出现过非常严重的通货膨胀，反而出现了一个悖论，就是现在拉美的中央银行都对通货膨胀非常的紧张，反而是采取了非常严谨紧缩的财政性的政策。因此不管是法国还是美国，通货膨胀再次出现的时候，拉美是不会走那一条路的，因为他们父辈的记忆的痛苦还太深了。因此盖夫先生提出了一个问题，他认为拉美债务现在反而是很好的一个对冲资产，包括实物资产 金等等都是不错的。大宗商品之前我们也讲过，也是保护自己的一种方式。买价值性的股票、买商品、买长期股票、买拉美债、买黄金，可能短期来看啊不会让你一飞冲天，但是可能会让你现在这一种积极欧美市场的投资组合有所缓冲。所以今天呢，在最后我们也为大家进行相关的补充。今天节目啊，我们为大家介绍的是 Gavaco 的创始人盖夫先生对于世界、对于美国、对于中国经济的一系列论述。在节目的末尾呢，我们也特别附上了这一段播客采访中的相关部分，希望对你有所启发。好了，以上就是本期思想先驱报的全部部分，下期我们再会。
谢谢。
That was the point someone had made to me specifically, that if you're getting your healthcare kind of free from, or quasi-free from the government system, when they report numbers that would otherwise be folded into GDP as, you know, the healthcare that I personally purchase in the US, that number is just absent in the accounting, even though there is a doctor providing that service to the person in China. And similarly, yeah, go ahead. Similarly with education.
And if you look, I think if you look at the US, healthcare is what? It's now 18% of US GDP or something. Quoting from memory, but it's a big number. So if instead of an 18, you've got a 2.
Right.
You know, and education, if instead of
and the college going percentage, so the percentage of high school graduates who leave high school and go to college in China is now about 60%. So it's similar to the US level. So it doesn't seem like they're actually lacking educational services in China, but somehow the accounting makes it such that it appears that part of their economy is much, much smaller than in the United States. So that somebody made this point to me, and I was just curious whether how big is that distortion in the comparison?
Oh, it's definitely a big one. And your US college student pays 50 grand a year, 60 grand a year. Your Chinese college student pays
2,000 or something.
To be honest, well, no, like 2,000 renminbi. It's a rounding error. And so, so you are in essence comparing apples and oranges, but there is also the element of, as China, as incomes continue to grow. Now, granted, they might not be growing as fast as they did 10 years ago, 20 years ago, but they are still growing. So as incomes grow, you are still going to see more money being spent in tourism, more money being spent on entertainment, more money being spent on education, on healthcare. Because yes, you can go to the public healthcare, but the reality is, rich people don't want to do that. They now want, no, but it's true. Like if you have a chance to go to a private clinic, you're going to pick that over the
no, it's fair, totally fair.
And so money starts to get spent there. For now, it's a small minority of people, but in 5 years' time, that number will be up 5x, 10x, and so I highlight this because this is also China's challenge. We talked earlier how China's graduating. It's going to be graduating 12.3 million kids this year, 11.7 last year. These are kids who want jobs, in an air-conditioned office with a phone and a laptop. They don't want to be, pouring concrete or beating pavements with a sledgehammer. And the problem for the government is it's not like there's 12 million guys working in the service industry in China today that are going to be retiring at the end of this year to make room for the 12 million kids coming in. So, if you look at the government 20 years ago, the challenge was you had 20 million guys leave the farm for the city every year, guys and girls leave the cities for the cities every year, leave the farm for the cities. And so what they did with these guys is say, okay, well, we need to build a road here and we need to build a power plant here and a subway line over there. Now, transforming a farmer into a bricklayer, that's actually not that hard, right? It's, but now, technically what you'd want is somebody to say, okay, we need an insurance company here and a sports marketing business there and a private hospital here. But the government can't really do that. Right? It's not like the government can say, oh, let's build a sports marketing business here. That just doesn't work. That's got to come from the bottom up. And here, the only thing the government can do is create the right conditions for that to occur. But it'll need to happen because if you're going to graduate 12 million kids a year, you need to find jobs for them.
Yeah. My guess is that this reported very high youth unemployment number is just because so many kids go to college now in China. It was such a rapid transition from very few going to, 60% of the kids going to college. Now, all of those kids expect to have white collar, knowledge worker type jobs, and there just aren't that many available in the economy for them right now. So some of them are going to have to just bite the bullet and do something which is a little bit less glamorous than what they thought they were going to college for.
So there's that, but also remember that all these kids are the fruits of 2 generations of one-child policy.
Yep.
So they have 4 grandparents, 2 parents, no cousins, no brothers and sisters. So they actually also have the option of staying at home, and a lot of them do, of waiting for the right job.
Yep.
Because, if you have 5 kids, you tell the kids you're not staying at home.
Yeah.
Your kids are out of here.
Yep.
Go make your way, which was always the way in China, by the way, right? And that's why, for years all these guys were leaving the farm, because if you were one of 5 kids on a farm, if you divide the land 5 ways, you're left with, not a lot of land. It's not economical. And so, for years and years and years, people in China really had no choice but to leave. Sometimes they left for the Chinese cities, but sometimes they left much further afield. They went all across Southeast Asia, to the Americas, to, to Australia. There really wasn't much choice. But now there is, actually. There is no sort of gun to their head. Like, they can stay at home.
Yep.
And a lot of them do.
So this is something that is going to have to work itself through the system, and it may take some period of time, really, for the labor markets to equilibrate properly.
So did you ever read a book came out just after the 2008 crisis called Outliers by Malcolm Gladwell?
Sure, yeah.
It was a fun read. And one of the points he makes, he looks at odd things that occur, like, how all the hockey players are born in November and December, and how all the tech guys, you take Bill Gates, Steve Jobs, Scott McNealy, Paul Allen, Steve Wozniak, like all of them, like sort of the first wave of the big tech founders, the guys who did Microsoft, Apple, Sun Microsystem, Oracle, all these guys were all born within 12 months of each other. Mm-hmm. And the point Malcolm Gladwell makes is, look, it was basically the first PC sort of came out when these guys were 20 years old. And so if you were like already 25 or 28, chances are you were married. And so you stayed at your job at IBM or at General Electric or wherever. And, these guys, they fiddled around with the computer, et cetera. But I actually think Gladwell missed a bigger point, because I think if you were 24, 25, you still weren't married. The bigger point was that all these guys were also college dropouts, mm-hmm. like literally, like almost all of them, mm-hmm. Bill Gates, Steve Jobs, etc. And they were in college. They dropped out in 74, 75 when the U.S. was going through a terrible, really bad recession. Mm-hmm. Now, when I went to college, I went to Duke, and, the deal was pretty simple. You keep your head down, you do your work, you get good grades, then maybe you get recruited by Morgan Stanley or by McKinsey or by Goldman Sachs, and then, you work hard while you're there, and then at the end of it all, you'll have the Hamptons house and, and the sports car. If you keep your head down and just do well, there was no real reason to really go out of your way.
Take risk.
You take risks. Like, why would you, right? This is like, if I just stay in the rails, everything's good. But in 74, 75, that wasn't an option. If you were at Harvard in 74, 75, you'd like, well, what the hell? Like, I'm going to stay here. There's no job with IBM at the end of this, and there's no job with GE at the end of this. So I might as well try my thing. And so I think that's what's going to happen in China.
So you see a lot of entrepreneurs coming out of this group of kids right now that are dealing with this high unemployment rate?
I think you will. One of the jokes we tell each other in Asia is that the tragedy of Asia is that Japan's a profoundly socialist country on which capitalism was imposed, and China's a profoundly capitalist country on which socialism was imposed.
Yeah, I agree.
And that both are drifting back to their natural order of things.
Yeah.
And if you've spent time in Japan or China, it rings true. It rings true. Like, China is a profoundly capitalist place.
I agree with you 100%. The Japanese are much more collectivistic than the Chinese. and even more orderly and rule obeying. And the Chinese are much more likely to be natural entrepreneurs than Japanese, actually.
Yeah. And by the way, look at historically. We mentioned how through the 19th and 20th century, a lot of Chinese people had no choice but to export themselves. They ended up running all the businesses in Southeast Asia. Like you go to Indonesia, you go to Thailand, you go to Vietnam, like all the business like leaders, empires, etc. It was all Chinese.
Yep.
China is a deeply entrepreneurial culture. The Chinese culture is a deeply entrepreneurial culture.
Yep. I wanted to switch gears a little bit and come back to this trade surplus. So China's running this ginormous trade surplus right now. Looks like it's set to continue for some time. U.S. is always a deficit country. How do you see the flows of money? How is the U.S. going to fund its debt obligations? What do the treasury auctions look like lately? Do you have any? I know you have some views on how this is going to shake out.
Well, lately they've been looking ugly. The simple answer is your last question. How have the treasury auctions been looking? And the answer is they've been looking ugly because look, the U.S. is now the U.S. is 4% of the global population. It's 60% of global budget deficits. If you include 40% of global budget deficits and 60% of global current account deficits. So you had all the world's budget deficits, you had all the world's current account deficits, and so the U.S. needs to constantly attract foreign capital, which it historically never had any problem doing, but never in those quantities. What is really quite unusual about the current cycle is that you have a U.S. economy that's growing by 8.5% nominal GDP, where you have full employment. Like you want a job in the U.S. today, you've got a job. And basically at the peak of its boom, the U.S. is running budget deficits of 8% of GDP. That's what's completely, unprecedented relative to any other period in history. And I think it's starting to make the market more and more uncomfortable because, again, the numbers are getting bigger and bigger and bigger.
The surplus countries that could recycle their flows back into the U.S. seem to be countries that the U.S. is directly antagonizing, like China, Saudi Arabia. I mean, like what's happening in Gaza with the U.S. backing those activities, it seems to me, going to make the Saudis less and less likely to want to show up at the Treasury auction and buy a bunch of U.S. debt, right? So how do you see all that?
You saw last week what I think was a massive event. The Central Bank of Saudi Arabia signed a swap line with the PBOC, the Chinese central bank.
Yes.
Now, why the hell would they do that? Why they've got a pegged currency to the dollar, and they've got what they sell is priced in dollars, right? Oil. So why would they need a swap line with China? Just signing a swap line with China is in essence saying we're going to need renminbi. Now, why would Saudi need renminbi for? Is Saudis starting to signal that they might depeg to the U.S. dollar, that they might start signing long-term deals with China for oil in renminbi? I don't know the answer. What I know is they announced this currency swap, and to me, that seems like one of the most important monetary developments of the recent years. And surprisingly, like nobody's really commenting on it. And I've been trying to get my head around it.
Yeah, I think
it's a momentous event.
I think those developments are super interesting, and in fact, I think it's becoming more and more plausible that Saudi could get security guarantees from Russia and China, just as it has now from the U.S., because their military technologies and presence are going to be sufficient to guarantee Saudi security eventually, so that they could shift over to a different patron than the United States.
Well, I think it's not so much security guarantees, but for me, the one of the biggest developments of the past year, again, that we didn't really mention much in the Western world, is how China got Iran and Saudi Arabia around the table to shake hands and make a peace deal. In essence, this was like the Camp David Accord, except it wasn't brokered by the U.S., it was brokered by China. And, what China basically said to both Saudi and Iran is it said, look, I'm your biggest trading partner, both of you. Like, you now sell more to me than to anybody else. And I want to do more business with you. And I want to invest in your country. but I'm not going to do that if you guys are going to go to war with each other. Because if you go to war with each other, I'm going to lose on both sides. So, you know, if you guys get along, we can do a lot of great stuff together. Now, the reality is Iran, the only reason Iran survives is at this point China. And economically, you know, Saudi Arabia tried to crush it. The U.S. tried to crush it. But given that it's got China's backing now, it's not gonna get crushed. So I think Saudi realizing this says, okay, China can always put pressure on Iran to do what they want. So I might as well and if you're Saudi, you only have one enemy. It's Iran, right? You're not worried about Israel. Israel's not going to come and attack Saudi. So your only enemy and you're no longer worried about Russia or the Soviet Union like you were in the past. So your only enemy is Iran. So, you know, if you can cut a deal with China to cut a deal with Iran, that takes care of your biggest problem. And I think that's what we've seen.
I think you've mentioned that instead of recycling its surpluses into dollars or treasuries, it looks like China might be building up oil reserves or energy reserves with those surpluses. Is that part of the picture here?
I think it is. It's very tough to know what exactly China's doing with its reserves, but there is something indeed, you know, China's got trade surplus, like we mentioned, 75, 80 billion a month, but China's actually not only not been buying treasuries, but letting its existing treasuries expire. So it's basically using fewer and fewer treasuries out there. Stocking fewer and fewer treasuries. Now, if you're China, you know, why would you have treasuries in the first place? Well, you bought treasuries to cushion the, you know, your potential hits on commodities, right? Or if ever tomorrow, you know, you either can't get access to dollars or commodity prices go through the roof for whatever reason, then you sell your treasuries and you buy the commodities you need. But if you're China, and especially following the Western world's grabbing of Russia's treasuries, if you're China, you think, hold on, I've been accumulating treasuries in the case I needed oil. That was really the main thing. So maybe I just accumulate oil. Like, you know, why the intermediate step where I make myself dependent on the willingness and ability of the U.S. to deliver me my money when tomorrow, you know, they've shown that they can take it away in a heartbeat. So I think the nationalization of Russia's reserves was the biggest foreign policy own goal, you know, since probably the start of the Iraq War. You know, I think we cut our nose to spite our faces. Western policymakers wanted to be seen to be doing something to punish Russia. And what we did is we said, okay, let's tell the biggest commodity producer in the world that they can't use US dollars. And I think we thought like this, they won't be able to sell their commodities. And we never stopped to think, well, they'll sell them in another currency.
Yeah, exactly.
Which is exactly what's happened. And I think any 5-year-old would have figured that one out, but somehow we rode right past it.
So I remember, I think 5 or 10 years ago, China didn't even have a strategic oil reserve. And have they publicly declared how big that's going to be and how far along they are in filling it up?
No, and China's that's like complete top state secret. And so I think there's a lot of reserve accumulation at the importer level, you know, the Sinopecs of this world. I think they've been building more and more sort of storage capacity, but they're definitely building strategic petroleum reserves. If you look at, you know, the official consumption numbers, the official production numbers, and the import numbers, China's probably been importing 1 million barrel per day too much. Somewhere between half a million and 1 million barrel per day too much for the past couple of years. Which again, I think if you're China, makes perfect sense. You've got too many dollars. You don't know what to do with them. And at the same time, you're living in a world with much more geopolitical uncertainty. You've got the U.S. that you feel is out to get you. You've got a war between Russia and Ukraine. I mean, tomorrow, for all you know, and I don't think it's going to happen, but if you're China, you know, you plan for the worst, you hope for the best, you plan for the worst. Tomorrow, again, in China's point of view, but what if Russia sort of devolves into a massive civil war? You know, Putin dies, is killed, falls. You had a sort of glimpse of it with the Wagner Group's march onto Moscow. Yeah, you're like, I thought, I woke up that Saturday morning, I thought, oh my God, I don't own enough oil. If Russia starts to collapse into a civil war, it's like, what price oil? So if you're China and you think, okay, maybe that's only a 5% possibility, but if it does, it's going to completely screw my economy. Why wouldn't you stock oil?
I think
especially if you got too many dollars that you know what to do with.
I think it's a no-brainer. They had to at some point build a strategic reserve. It was kind of just their development outpaced their scale risk.
Their ability to do so.
What's interesting though is when they get to the point where they've reached a reasonable level for that petroleum reserve,
SPR.
Will they continue to just stock up oil as a store of value or something because they don't want to own treasuries? That when they get to that point, it becomes a more kind of interesting question. It's like not for free anymore, right?
No. To your point, look, there is a cost of building an SPR, right? You got to pay the storage, and it costs money. You don't want to just do it for forever. So yeah, at that point, what will they do with the extra dollars? My guess is it'll be a pass the parcel game. They'll be buying assets. They'll be buying copper mines in Africa. They'll be buying, fields in Argentina to grow food. Whatever asset comes up for sale, they'll pick up, because on a 20-year view, owning a copper mine in Zaire or in Zambia or in Mozambique might be a smarter trade than owning a U.S. Treasury anyway.
Yep. So
at least for them.
To the $1 trillion question, not to put you on the spot here, but this turbulence we see in the Treasury auctions, at what point does it really become a real fundamental problem for the U.S. to fund its deficits?
So I think before it becomes a problem, you still have one more bullet, and that the Fed can come in and monetize a lot of the debt. Like once the U.S. government starts hitting real funding issues, the Fed will step in, and then the U.S. dollar will go down. And initially, that first drop in the U.S. dollar will feel great because the U.S. dollar is overvalued. We were discussing how cheap Japan is, and how China's got a $75 billion trade surplus. Initially it'll feel good, and a lot of sort of industrial linked states, your Michigans, your Indianas, your Pennsylvanias, where by and large, the Rust Belt states where the elections are decided very often anyway, they're sort of increasingly the swing states. All these states will feel great. So initially, it'll feel fine. Eventually, though, that will catch up with higher inflation, weaker currency, debt printing. You'll get higher inflation unless, of course, the U.S. starts to tighten its fiscal belt. But, right now there seems to be little appetite for that.
Yeah.
So what seems more likely to me is that, at some point in the next couple of years, or maybe even much earlier than that, the Fed steps back in, monetizes the debt, and then from there, dollar goes down, and that creates the next boom. But during that boom, if the U.S. doesn't tighten its fiscal belt, then you start running into trouble.
So that Fed stepping in to monetize the debt. So I guess their balance sheet is like 11 trillion right now, or something like this. 12 trillion. What does the Fed actually have on its balance sheet?
From the top of my head, no. I think it's a bit lower than that. I think. I think you're 9 trillion.
Oh, 9 trillion.
I can't remember from the top of my head. I'll have to check. I can't remember from the top of my head. Sorry.
At what point do macro guys like yourself start to say, wait a minute, flashing red light? So there's a serious problem here.
I think a lot of macro guys, you have a framework, and then you wait for the momentum to start confirming your framework. And I think a lot of people have always talked about the problem of U.S. debt. And so far, the U.S. Treasuries have sold off, no doubt. The next leg should be the U.S. dollar. Now, you could tell me, well, it started. The U.S. dollar has been weak the past 3-4 weeks, but I think you need to see a little more sort of downside momentum, key levels being broken, and then the macro guys come in and start, piling on the trade.
I see.
But we're not there yet.
Okay. That's my main worry. I've worked all my life building up some net worth for my kids, mostly because I don't really spend the money. But the main thing I have to navigate is this sort of, I don't know, next 20 years of de-dollarization so that, my nest egg preserves its real value for my kids. That's my main worry in terms of financial strategy.
Well, it sounds like you've got the AR-15s, so that's a good first step.
I guess those won't.
Canned goods.
Yeah.
Canned goods and weapons, they never depreciate. Those are always worth something. No, look, jokes aside, I think what you highlight, and I'm sorry to be flippant about this because this is a real issue. The issue you highlight, I didn't mean to sound flippant. It's a real problem because for the past 30, 40 years, you could count on fixed income to protect a good bit of your wealth. And, for the past 2-3 years, that hasn't been the case. And there's been a brutal wake-up call for a lot of investors that, how much capital could be destroyed. We've just had a really horrible bear market. And, CNBC talks all days about stocks. And, when you're at the gym or whatever and you're looking at the TV, you get the stock tickers go by, et cetera. But, long dated bonds, like they've just wiped out 15 trillion of capital. The bond bear market has wiped out 15 trillion of capital. That's proper money. Has been serious capital destruction for a lot of savers, and a lot of savers who were conservative savers who didn't want to go out there on the risk curve and take too much risk, etc. And they've been absolutely butchered. Anyway, going back to your question, it does raise the question indeed. Like so far, the pain has been on the fixed income. Do we leave it at that? And it's good that the pain's been taken and now we're reset and we can start again. Option one. Or option two, that was the first step. And the next step is the dollar. And the next step is the dollar because the U.S. government remains incontinent. I think the options of option two is indeed there. So from there, how do you protect portfolios? And so, one of the things I like a lot Latin American debt. You get high real rates. You have governments that are actually polar opposite of ours. It's always the same story. You don't make your father's mistake. You make your grandfather's mistakes. In Latin America, they had inflation not that long ago. So as soon as inflation appears in the system, the central banks, bang, and ministries of finance tighten fiscal policy because they know the long-term consequences. Meanwhile, in our countries, whether France or America, as when inflation reappeared, all our policymakers were clapping like seals. They're like, yay, inflation, we want it higher for longer. We're going to keep this thing going. And you're wondering, are you trying to destroy people's wealth here? What's going on? And the reality is they were, and they really still are, actually. They really keep following crazy fiscal policies because they feel that's how they're going to get reelected.
Yeah.
They're buying your votes with your money.
Yep.
And so, to your point, how do you protect yourself against that? Well, I think Latin American debt is one of them. I think real assets, gold, etc., historically have proven to be not bad. Commodities is a way to protect yourself. But deep down, if you go through the periods of big inflation, you got absolutely crushed in bonds. Equities you made okay, actually, because if you don't pay up too much for the equity, you can still do okay. So I would say, to answer your question, buy value stocks, buy commodities. You can also have some growth stocks in there as well, of course.
Yeah.
Buy Latin America debt and buy some gold, and that may not hit it out of the park, but it should allow you to cushion the portfolio.
That was a great answer to my question. I think the main problem I have is that, for most of my life, you could buy the 60-40 portfolio and just go to sleep. And now you actually have to think and figure things out to actually stay ahead of things.
万事不求人，私人助理、私人顾问时代来临了。六度万事，万事相助，超强博士群不断奉献专项服务，信息、财经、健康、文娱、教育、旅游、消费、科技、美食，让您的生活品质全线升级。六度世界现在体验，请去3W 点6度点 WORLD
限时免费期间，全体注册网友免费使用付费版的高级功能如下：支持论坛搜索，免费画图。第一步，点击右上角最左边的机器人符号开始对话，像图片中红框中的那样。第二步，如图选择六度万事，我们未来将推出更多的 AI 供大家选择。然后就可以与六博士悄悄畅谈了。还支持论坛内部信息搜索哦。您还可以让六博士做你的助手，帮你绘制漂亮图片。最后可以点击添加好友进来，一起与六博士工作。一起来 3w.6度.world 尝试吧。